Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's public meeting for the Bellwether District. We're going to wait a few minutes to get started, so hang tight and we'll get started shortly. Thank you. Hi, everyone. If you just joined us, we're going to wait for a few minutes for others to log on, and then we'll get started. Thank you. Hi, everyone. If you just joined, we are going to wait just a few more minutes for others to join, and then we'll get started. Thank you. Okay, I think we can get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our final community meeting of the year. Tonight's meeting will be somewhat narrow in focus. We will be specifically sharing updates on planned closure of waste storage locations at the Bellwether District. In a moment, I will turn things over to my colleagues, Stephanie Eggert and Juliana Connolly. But first, I just wanted to share some information about how we will be conducting Q&A tonight. First, we'll be taking all questions following tonight's presentation, so please save your questions until the end. Second, we're really trying to prioritize questions related to tonight's topic, so please keep that in mind. If you have a question, please feel free to enter it into the Q&A function in the chat. But if you would like to ask your question live, please raise your virtual hand, and my colleagues, Corey and Matt, will give you the ability to show your camera and unmute your line. We ask that you please limit your live questions to 1 per person and to 60 seconds per question, so that we can ensure everyone receives equal time and we get through as many as we can. We will, as always, get through as many questions as time allows, but if we don't get to your question immediately or this evening, we'll follow up after the meeting by posting responses to our website. And so with that in mind, I'll turn things over to
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Mia. So tonight, as Mia mentioned, we're going to discuss the closure of the hazardous waste locations on the property. And if you could go to the next slide. We'll run through the agenda here. So we'll talk about the purpose of this meeting, a little bit about HRP for those that are not familiar, where we are on the project, basic project update on the site. And then we'll get into the details of the hazardous waste locations that we're looking to close, which there are 2, and discuss the closure process and where we're going to go after this meeting, and then we'll end with an opportunity for Q&A. Next slide. So the presentation tonight will be handled by myself. I'm the Senior Vice President of Operations, and I'm excited to be here to talk about this tonight, and Juliana Conley, who is our Executive Vice President of Environmental Remediation. Next slide. Okay, so why are we here? We're here today to discuss closure of 2 of our hazardous waste storage locations on the site. And we would like to provide you all with an opportunity to comment on this closure plan and ask any questions that you might have that pertain to it. On our facility, there are 3 storage locations where hazardous waste was permitted to be stored. And these were legacy storage locations that we are now looking to close in coordination and consistent with our plan to develop the property. One of these locations, which is on the northern portion of the property, went through a closure process and a similar conversation in October of 2021. And now we are moving to the locations. There are the 2 that we'll discuss tonight that are on the Girard portion of the property, which we are looking to close over the course of the next roughly 9 to 12 months, which we'll outline here. Next slide. So a little bit about Hilco Redevelopment Partners. Again, if you're not familiar, we are very focused in the business of transformation. And as you all are hopefully aware, we are in the process of transforming this facility from what once was an operating refinery to what will be a future redeveloped property to revitalize and reinvigorate the area. We are focused in 3 basic pillars: environment, economy, and community. And we like these pillars to join together in all of our projects and our activities in order to create successful outcomes for us and the surrounding communities. Next slide. So what have we been doing? So, you know, in the spirit of transformation, these are some photos from the site decommissioning and demolition activity, which started a little bit more than 2 years ago, so roughly 2.5 years ago. And just, you know, some statistics are shown here, but I think picture's worth 1,000 words. This is one of the areas in the facility that previously was a refinery process unit. And now you can see that it has been cleared and the infrastructure has been taken down and removed. If you go to the next slide, there are some additional overhead photos. And so this is really the Point Breeze section or the more northern portion of the property, in which you can see that a significant portion of the demolition has been complete here. And on the next slide, you'll see the Girard Point portion of the property, which is slightly behind the Point Breeze. We started in the northern part of the property and moved down south as far as the demolition activities. And this is a kind of where we are today. So if you go to the next slide, in connection with the fact that we've completed the, thank you. In connection with the fact that we've started in the northern portion of the site, that is why we completed the closure, or we're in progress on completing the closure in the hazardous waste storage location there, which is circled here in red. And that has been, that pad or that storage location has been removed, physically removed, and soil sampling and testing. There's a number of iterations of that, and that is all underway now for that pad to be officially closed. And then we'll look to develop in that area. And if you go to the next slide, the areas that we're now working towards are the areas, again, more in the southern portion of the property. There are 2, the Girard Point, what used to contain spent caustic, and then what which is one area, and the second area, which was a storage pad for hazardous waste. So starting with the spent caustic tanks, these are 2 separate areas, so they will follow two separate closure processes, though the steps are very similar. So there are 2 spent caustic tanks, and again, these previously stored or contained spent caustic. They're within a shared containment, secondary containment area, concrete containment area. And so the steps that will be taken to manage the closure of these tanks is the waste, the spent caustic has been removed and shipped off-site, disposed of. The tanks, the physical tanks, infrastructure lines have been flushed and cleaned. So they went through a really decommissioning exercise. The tanks were then demolished. The containment area, the concrete area where these tanks sat, was cleaned, washed. And then the soil will be sampled underneath it, and we will go through a complete closure, regulatory closure of that area that previously contained these tanks. Next slide. So similarly, there's another area, this Girard Point hazardous waste container storage pad, and that storage pad was used to store hazardous waste in drums and roll-off bins. This closure will follow a similar process. However, obviously a little bit different in that there's no tanks contained on this. So this is a concrete pad. So the waste will be sent off-site for disposal. The pad will then be washed and decontaminated, the concrete broken up and removed, and then the soil will be sampled. So again, similar sort of process. This activity will take place following the spent caustic tanks. So we're working the spent caustic tanks first, and then we plan to move to the Girard Point hazardous waste location. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Juliana Conley, who will talk through the soil sampling plans.
Thanks, Stephanie. Good evening, everyone. So yeah, I'll talk through the soil sampling that we'll do after these concrete pads are removed. And the purpose of the soil sampling is really to assess whether any historical releases that may have occurred on these concrete pads have impacted the underlying soil. So a release would be something like if there was a drum stored on this pad historically, and that the contents of that drum or container somehow made it outside of the container and then spilled onto the pad, and did that contamination then have the potential to move into the underlying soil. That's sort of what the concept of the soil sampling, why we're doing it, is to see chemically if any releases did occur beneath this pad, because we can't always see the contamination just by looking at it. So I just want to be clear, we don't know of any specific releases or spills that occurred. We don't have any documentation indicating that a release occurred, but we'll still do the sampling to see if there was something that was perhaps not noted. The sample locations, which I'll show on the next two slides, have been selected really with two things in mind. One is just to get good coverage across the whole area of these two concrete pads. So you'll see some locations, you'll see grids, just sort of boxes drawn out across the concrete pad. And we make sure that we have a sample location in each of those grid boxes to make sure that we have coverage across the whole area. Then we specifically are locating sampling locations in areas that are sort of most likely to be impacted if a release or spill did occur in the past. And so what I mean by that is there are some locations in these pads where there are trenches or drains or piping that may have been used, and those are more likely to have resulted in contamination if a release occurred at the surface of the pad. So we're sampling near those locations, and I'll show you that on the next slides. Or if there's an area, say, where the concrete appears to be sort of degraded, we would sample near that, because that creates sort of a higher potential for a release to make it through the concrete. Another concept is that if there's visual staining on the concrete, could be just something like rust, but if that staining is indicative of a historic spill, we want to make sure we're sampling near that. So that's how the locations are selected, really with those two concepts in mind. One, getting good spatial coverage across the whole area, and two, really trying to sample in areas where, if contamination is present, where we're likely to see it, if that makes sense. So I'll show, as I mentioned, I'll show those on the next slides. The way the sampling, sorry, go back please. Thank you. The way the sampling will be conducted is that we drill what's called a soil boring. So a drill is used to drill down into the soil, and that boring will be advanced to either 8 feet, either a depth of 8 feet below the surface of just the ground surface in that area, or until we reach what's called the water table. And so the water table is where water is present in the subsurface. So if the water table is shallower than 8 feet, the boring would be advanced to the water table. The soil samples that we'll collect and put in a jar and send to the laboratory will be collected from a depth based on sort of 2 things. One, if we do observe any evidence of contamination during installation of the boring, we'll collect the soil from that depth. And so the things that could indicate contamination are things like odors, visual staining. There's also some screening tools that we can use on the site that are indicative of contamination. So if we see any of that evidence of contamination, we'll make sure that the soil sample is collected from that depth interval. If there is no evidence of contamination observed in the soil boring, we'll collect the soil sample from the depth sort of immediately below the feature of interest. So if it's near a trench, it'll be right below where the trench was, or it'll be right below the concrete slab. So that's how the depths will be selected. So earlier I was talking about how sort of horizontally we position the sampling locations, and then the depths are based on what we observe as we go down with depth. And then each soil sample gets put in a jar or multiple jars and sent to the laboratory, where the laboratory then analyzes the soil for the specific list of chemicals that are associated with this property. And now you can go to the next slide, thanks. So this is the spent caustic tank area that Stephanie was talking about. And so the yellow outlines show that grid that I was talking about, those boxes, to make sure that we have sampling locations across the entire area. And then if you can see, there are blue and green dots that show the locations of the soil borings. So that's the sort of horizontal locations where each of those borings will be positioned. And again, that represents a location where we'll drill down to either the water table or to 8 feet below ground, and we'll collect a soil sample at the depth interval as I described before, either where evidence of contamination is observed or sort of immediately below the feature that we're investigating, whether that be a trench or just the slab itself. So that's the spent caustic tank. And then if you go to the next slide, this is the Girard Point hazardous waste storage pad. This area is a little bit bigger, so you see more of those yellow grids, but the concept is the same. We want to make sure we have a soil boring in each of those grid cells, as you see, and then the locations, if there's a trench, if those purple shapes that you see on there are indicative of observations made of the concrete. So whether the concrete was sort of distressed, whether there was staining, we want to make sure we have sample locations in those areas. Again, it's going to be in the soil beneath those areas after the concrete slab is removed. And then the depth of the sample is the same as I described before. We'll drill down to either 8 feet or until the water table is encountered, and the depth of the sample will be based on the observations during that installation of the boring. And then you can go to the next slide. And so this just really describes our next steps, where we are in this process, and the next steps will sort of be similar for the 2 storage areas. The concrete pads have been removed in both areas, or sorry, maybe just in the spent caustic tank area, excuse me, but the sampling will be conducted after the concrete pads are removed. And then if any contamination is identified as part of the laboratory analysis that I described, we'll do an additional investigation with paid-up oversight. And so the way that works is if we see concentrations above screening levels in these initial samples that we'll collect, we'll propose additional sampling to understand the extent of the impacts. After that sampling is all complete, We'll submit a certification and closure documentation to the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, and the dates of when we anticipate those closure activities will occur is shown on the slides here. So the first quarter of 2023 for the spent caustic tank area, and the third quarter of 2023 for the Girard Point waste container storage area. And I think that's all we have for the formal presentation this evening.
Okay, thank you, Juliana and Stephanie. Want to open things up for questions. We do have one question in the chat, but wanted to do a first call to confirm that there are no questions as of right now about this topic. Okay, so with that, I will turn to our question in the chat. The question is, I know this is off topic, but could you talk about the zoning bills related to the Hilco site that the Philadelphia City Planning Commission is meeting about this week? Some road widenings around the northern portion of the site. Blake, are you available to answer this one?
Yes. Hi, and good evening. So obviously over the last 2+ years, we've gone through an extensive master planning effort. When we initially acquired the site, we were proposing industrial to be at the northern portion of the property. Through our master planning efforts, we've chosen to pursue a life science development on that end of the site, and those bills ultimately will reflect that change. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any additional questions? Okay, hold on one moment. Okay, I am going to turn this one over to Juliana and or Stephanie. Question about the tanks. What substances are or were stored in the tanks, and how old are they?
So the materials that were stored in the tanks were spent caustic. And so that was stored in the tank prior to Hilco's ownership. And so when we took over the property, we took the remaining material that was in those tanks and disposed of it. I do not know how old that material was, but we did remove it.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. Let's go to one moment. For Juliana, who monitors your monitoring?
Sure, that's a great question. So all of this sampling is submitted to the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. So they would review all our sampling procedures and our sample results, and our activities would not be complete until the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection has signed off and we've addressed any questions that they may have.
Thank you. I'm just looking for additional questions related to this topic this evening, because the questions in the chat are not related to the topic. So I just want to do a general call. Are there, oh, actually, one moment. We have some questions from that folks want to ask live. So Matt, would you mind unmuting Charles Reeves?
Hello? Hello?
Hi, Charles, we can hear you.
Yeah,
Like a Christmas tree.
I got a multi-question too. The question about where the dirt, when you say you're going to remove the dirt to where, and is it going to be traced? You putting it in another community? Where you putting that toxic dirt?
So there's no plan to move this soil. This is just sampling. What we're talking about here is just sampling the soil to see if it has been contaminated. So there's no plan under this plan to move the soil. We're just collecting samples of the soil to send to the laboratory for chemical analysis.
Okay, second question. So you're really not done yet, because you're saying 12 months, it's gonna take another 12 months to be totally done, right? So you're not done, so you're gonna come back again when it's clean?
That's right. So this meeting is just to describe the sampling that we plan to do, and then we'll get the results back from those samples in 2023. That's
All
right. The samples have not been collected yet.
All right, thank you.
Yep, no problem.
Okay, great. Matt, we have another question from Ellen Rolfing. If you could move her into the meeting.
Sorry, she should be joining shortly. Ellen.
Thanks, Matt. And everyone, thanks for your patience. It takes some time to move people back and forth. Appreciate it. Ellen, feel free to unmute yourself and show your camera if you would like and ask your question. Thanks.
I'm so sorry. I just was wondering about the traffic around there because I do a lot of work in the Navy Yard and go to the airport and stuff. And it's just like a major opportunity, I think, to connect 76 to the airport. And I was just wondering if you have any plans for that. And I'm sorry that I'm going through the hazardous waste meeting instead of the planning. So I'll be quiet now.
Yeah, hi, Ellen. I think I can take that one. So we are going through a pretty significant traffic improvement analysis. We're trying to pursue really all avenues as we're trying to figure out the best ways we can improve it. 76 directly to the airport is an interesting one for sure. And I think it's something that we could pursue. But in the interim, we have not necessarily evaluated that. But great question and something we can certainly take back.
Great, thank you, Blake. We'll go to one of our questions from the chat. Is any of the shallow groundwater beneath the soil samples being sampled?
Thanks, Mia. Yeah, and that's a great question. So at this point, we start with soil sampling, and that would be typical for this type of investigation. So we'll start with the soil sampling, and then based on what the soil sample results show us, we may move on to groundwater sampling, and it would start with that shallow groundwater or additional soil sampling, depending on what we see. So I guess a simple way to think about it is if we have exceedances of standards that indicate the potential for groundwater impact, then we would move to groundwater sampling. And if we don't, then we might not. And so an environmental sampling like this is usually an iterative process. So where we start, collect some information, get some data, and then based on that, we might need to come back. So it's possible, but it's not the starting point. The groundwater sampling would not be where we start.
Thank you. Another question from the chat. Have you considered installing a solar farm on the roofs of the planned warehouses that are planned?
Yeah, I'll take that one, Mia. Another great question. We absolutely are. We're investigating the benefits of doing so. With that, we'll ultimately, hopefully drive through the entire industrial development because, these big boxes provide a lot of real estate to do so and can provide a ton of benefits ultimately for the tenants on the site, as well as the surrounding community. So great question. We're definitely pursuing it.
Great, thank you. just want to ask again, because we have a few questions that are in the chat that are unrelated to tonight's topic. We're good to answer them, but want to just make a call for questions related to tonight's topic. Okay, with that, we'll go to some additional questions in the chat. Let's go to, when will the revised master plan be done? When will the revised traffic study be received?
All right, I can take that one. So the revised master plan is ever changing, as you can imagine. We have nailed down a new master plan on the north end of the site for our first phase of development on the life science side. And then on the industrial side, we've nailed down what we're calling our first phase one there, which are 2 buildings, about a total of 1 million square feet between the two. So we have ultimately been in constant communication with the Philadelphia Streets Department and PennDOT. We are actively responding to their comments associated with the traffic impact study, and we're continuing to refine that. Thank you.
Thanks, Blake. I'm probably going to turn this right back to you. What potential uses are being explored for the area south of the Platte Bridge?
Yep, no problem. Great question again. So that's an interesting area of the site. Currently still industrial. It does provide a lot of benefits with the existing wharf that's on site, rail. So there's a bunch of different tenants that we could potentially pursue. But today we're still focused on industrial in that area.
Okay, let's take one from the chat that's relevant to the topic. Can you give us some more information on what was in the spent caustic? For example, what contaminants will you be testing for?
Juliana, do you want to talk through anything specifically on the soil sampling? We're not, just to be clear, the spent
Sure.
caustic. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Sure. So, so spent caustic means they're potentially corrosive materials that would have been used during the refinery process. The constituents of the soil samples will be analyzed for is a site-specific list of constituents. So constituents that are known to be present in other areas of the site, and chemicals that are known to have been used at the site. So it won't be just only what may have been present in the spent caustic tanks, but it's a list of constituents that are routinely analyzed for at this site and that are known to be constituents of concern in soil and groundwater at the site. And sorry, to be more specific about that, those include certain volatile organic compounds, things like benzene, certain semi-volatile organic compounds, also metals like lead. So there will be there's a list of chemicals that are routinely sampled for at the site.
Thank you, Juliana. I'm going to go to a live question from Lisa. Matt, if you wouldn't mind moving her over to the meeting.
Sorry, Lisa, have you received the notification?
Okay, I think we can move on to the next question. So will there be job order to people in the Grace Ferry community, and will the farm tank be taken down? So I'll take the first portion of that question on job creation. So just to answer, we are heavily invested in workforce programs and partnerships that are going to help prepare local Philadelphians to receive jobs that we create, both construction-focused jobs in the near term, and then ultimately jobs created by our future tenants. And so, yes, it's a huge focus for us in ensuring that we're training people up locally to be able to receive jobs. And Stephanie, I don't know if you want to answer the second part of the question.
Sure. So currently the tank farm is in an idle, non-operational state. So there's no material moving in and out of the tank farm. And we have no immediate plan to demolish the tank farm, though we are evaluating future redevelopment of that site.
Okay, I think we only have one more question, and that is, how many tanks are there and what was stored in it? True gasoline or heat oil for your house?
I'm not sure if this is related to the tank farm or the caustic tanks or the former refinery proper. There was a lot of tanks. So Carol, if you can potentially give a little bit more context, we can appropriately answer that.
Yeah, and I think, Steph, we can speak to the tanks that were in the caustic storage area, which is part of the subject of this presentation. So I believe there were 2 tanks in that area, and those tanks would not have contained gasoline or heating oil. These were spent caustic tanks. So spent caustic being a sort of a used product that was part of the refining process, but is not the petroleum or sort of oil itself.
That's right.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make another call for any questions, particularly those related to tonight's topic, before we wrap up. One moment. Okay, I think we have one more in the chat. So what collaborations have you taken recently with Evergreen for deep soil testing across the site, now that lots of infrastructure has been removed? So the answer is about collaboration with Evergreen.
Sorry, I can speak to that. Having trouble taking myself off mute. So Evergreen, let me just take a moment because I don't think we've spoken about it during this call, this meeting, just so everybody understands. Evergreen is a party that also has, in addition to ourselves, has cleanup obligations on the site. The simplest way to think about it is that Evergreen and Sunoco are responsible for contamination that occurred in the soil and the groundwater at the property prior to September of 2012. And PESRM and HRP are responsible for contamination or releases that occurred after September 2012. So Evergreen has ongoing investigation, soil and groundwater sampling and cleanup activities that they are conducting. And we also have ongoing cleanup and sampling and investigation activities that we are conducting. One place that I can sort of speak to specifically with respect to this question is so I want to be clear, a lot of sampling and remediation and investigation activities have been ongoing at the property for decades. And a lot of that work could occur even while the refinery was in place. But yes, as the refinery has been decommissioned and demolished, that does create new space for sampling to occur. And these hazardous waste pads are one example of that. Other examples are where the refinery units, so like the actual, those big structures that you used to be able to see from the road, as those comes down, Evergreen does come in and sample beneath those refinery units. And then as all the above ground storage tanks that would stored petroleum and oil and gasoline and all of those things, as all of those have come down, we, PESRM and HRP, sample below those. So we're in regular communication and coordination with Evergreen, and we both are doing lots of sampling and remediation at the site on an ongoing basis.
Thank you so much, Juliana. I just want to make one final call for questions, especially those related to this topic, before we wrap up tonight's meeting. And just as a reminder, if you come up with questions after the meeting and want to contact us, please email us at the Bellwether District website, which is www.thebellwetherdistrict.com, and we'll get back to you promptly. Any additional questions? Okay, thank you everyone for joining tonight's meeting, and we'll see you next year. Happy holidays.